Okay, so this is our Simondon reading group starting up again after a couple weeks. So we're picking up from page 628 of the PDF. Last time we read through a few shorter sections on the end of the 18th century and onwards. In these sections, Simondon talks about what he calls here Schwärmerei. This is a term that Kant used and was sort of prevalent in 18th century Germany for enthusiasm or a kind of religious obscurantism. And so the idea is a kind of participation in something that surpasses human reason, in some sort of spiritual reality that's beyond human reason. And so this kind of experience, or this search for this kind of experience, was a common theme in a lot of authors around this time. And so we looked at some of the sort of demonstrations that were done having to do with electricity. So we have these demonstrations where you have a chain of people holding hands, and then an electric current is passed from one end of the chain to the other. These were like extremely popular in Europe in the late 18th century. Everyone was wanted to have one of these demonstrations done. And so electricity is this sort of elemental force that in lightning, and it's this natural force that has this sort of obscure effect on us and on the natural world, and we sort of participate in it by doing these sort of demonstrations. So this was one instance of this sort of search for this experience that surpasses human reason. And then we looked at, we sort of quickly went through a few different authors. I won't go through them all in detail, but with Lessing and Herder and Goethe as well, there's a sort of dynamical quality to their work. They're all interested in not so much like categorizing different human activities or different elements of nature. They want to look at the development of these different principles or different aspects of nature. So Herder, for instance, has his book Ideas Towards a Philosophy of History, I think is the title. It's a sort of it starts with the formation of the solar system, and then the formation of the Earth, and then how animals appear and human beings arise out of that environment. So it's a sort of quasi-evolutionary history of the emergence of human beings, and then from there it goes through human history. So it's about this sort of developmental presentation of what it is to be a human being. And then Goethe likewise has his famous book on the metamorphosis of plants, where he wants to show how different aspects of the flower and other parts of plants are all forms of leaves that have been transformed. So the leaves undergo transformations that produce all these different structures that don't necessarily look like leaves on the surface. And so it's again a sort of developmental conception of nature. So this is a sort of common characteristic of all these authors in the late 18th century, is this idea of the natural world as being a world that undergoes development. And we'll see that this conception of a developmental aspect of the world sort of undergoes transformation when we get to the 19th century. And we can probably tie this with the 19th century notion of progress. And we'll see, I think, a bit about that in this 19th century section that we're going to read for today. Okay, so let me just get a drink and then I can read the first section. Okay, beginning of the 19th century. Hegel, Kant, Marx. Sociological thought marks the advent of a new period of reflection on the individual. After having exhausted all the ways of thinking the individual according to the order of simultaneity, then according to the order of succession, and finally according to the object into which he projects himself, either the artificial object that is a technical thing or human institution, or the natural object to which he's connected through his genesis, like the crystalline lattice to the whole crystal. and with the critical period having posited the necessity of recommencing to take up problems in a new spirit, it seems that thought renewed this vast movement of interrogation, first bearing on the order of simultaneity, then on the order of succession, and finally on the object in which the individual being is expressed, or to which he is connected. But the position of the problems is no longer effectuated on the same level. The individual is no longer an exemplar of being. He is always one among several. He is the member of a collectivity. The counterpart to this advent of sociology is that of the theory of species, of genetics, and of the theory of races. The order of simultaneity, as well as the order of succession, is defined by way of the inter-individual rapport. Society as a system of simultaneity and the species as a system of succession frame the individual and make it such that he is no longer studied as an absolute. The third stage, coming after the search for the order of simultaneity and for the order of succession, has not ended. It made its appearance with the thought of Marx, who sought to define man collectively by his rapport to the technically elaborated object, which contains a reference both to the order of simultaneity and to the order of succession, insofar as a part of human reality is found to be contained in capital, and more generally in the form of nature's exploitation by man, which are considered to be evolving in time. Above Marxist theory, there are indeed presuppositions of this doctrine that are new with respect to sociology and the theory of evolution, because they include the reference to an object that expresses man, i.e., the artificial object. A search for man's expression in the natural object also appears in our era. As noted by Émile Breillet, what changed at the beginning of the 19th century is the way in which man appears to himself. Hegel, for example, in his philosophy of history, refuses the attempt made by Rousseau to grasp an immediate and absolute essence of man, to which mores would be added afterwards. As Breillet says, taking up Hegel's thesis again, the human being is defined only as burdened with history, and humanity will not be attained by an abstraction that strips away everything it has acquired, but on the contrary, by the very law of this acquisition that makes it what it incrementally is. Knowledge is mediate. It only takes place by reflecting the becoming that produced it. This vision of human reality and of all philosophical problems grasps the individual not as a fully made reality, endowed by itself with reality and substantiality, but as a being who represents a certain moment of a reality vaster than it. This integration into the order of the successive corresponds for Auguste Comte to an integration into the order of the simultaneous, through which the integration into the order of the successive takes place. The two forms of integration in fact exist for Hegel as well as for Auguste Comte, but for Hegel, integration into the order of the successive is fundamental, while for Auguste Comte, integration into the order of the simultaneous is what is fundamental. History and society are the two realities on the basis of which individual reality can be grasped. Marx will seek to unite these two basic realities within the reality of class, which has a social aspect and a historical meaning at the same time, and effectuates an intersecting of the two orders. The individual is then grasped as the integral part of a class. Faith, instinct, love of humanity or altruism, the intuition of becoming, and class consciousness replaced the analysis of the 18th century, which sought to grasp the expression of the individual in the object. The individual rediscovers within himself the feeling of nationality, of race as the guiding forces of events, or of the positivity of thought as the conclusion of human becoming, and it is through this discovery that the individual grasps his essence. According to Renan's phrasing, the individual feels himself participating in the Tower of Babel, the floors of which are peoples. History is a faith and a source of energy. The human individual becomes aware of himself through the human sciences. Mediation is introduced into self-knowledge. The individual draws the forces of his action from a nature which is an immense reservoir of energy. Nature is no longer conceived as a structure, but as an ensemble of fields and of potential. In general, the vitalist character of the dynamism of the 19th century is revealed, and certainly with good reason. But it should be added that the discovery of the laws of electromagnetic induction, the precise measurement of fields, contributed to providing new schemas for reflexive thought. The individual is connected back to the system that surrounds him, even in the absence of any material contact, because he is in a field. The cohesion of the real is that of an ensemble of fields. Fields exert an action extremely different from the actions by contact of the static or the dynamic in mechanics, whereas antitypy is a property characteristic of material solids of mechanics, which makes it such that there can be only a single solid in one place, excluding all superposition and simultaneity of action. In this same place, there can be a multitude of fields without acting on one another, but all acting simultaneously on a single object in that place. For example, a body can be submitted at the same time to a magnetic field, an electrical field, and a gravitational field. The physical individual is that which is sensitive to fields, while fields not only do not exclude one another, but are not generally sensitive to one another. Furthermore, nascent thermodynamics also provided new schemas of thought, introducing a remarkable extension to the notion of potential energy and confirming at the very heart of scientific rationality the irreversibility of energetic transformations according to the principle of the increase in the entropy of a closed system. The singular being as well as the particular state are found to be connected to a universe according to space and time. A historical law appears in the physics of energy. The geometry of forces becomes that of fields and gradients. These realities are not mysterious, properly speaking. They are measurable with as much precision as those of 18th century physics, but they introduce schemas of thought in which the whole is no longer reducible to the sum or combination of elements. The place and the moment are no longer Kant's ideal diversity. The pure dispersion of phenomena, the phenomenon is already a spatial and temporal system in the form of a field or law of convergence of the series of successive states. So we have here a sort of recapitulation of the schema of the thought of the individual now applied to society. So where Simondon has identified these different ways of thinking of the individual, either according to the order of succession or the order of simultaneity. Now we have the thinking of society either as according to the order of succession or according to the order of simultaneity. So Simondon identifies Hegel with this order of succession taken as primary, and then Kant as the order of simultaneity taken as primary. And then he takes Marx to be a kind of synthesis of the two, or a way of thinking simultaneity and succession together. And then he also sort of compares this or draws an analogy with the development of physics in the 19th century. So we have in the order of simultaneity, we have the notion of a field. The electromagnetic field in particular appears in the 19th century. And so this is a kind of reality that surpasses the individual and that exists, that surrounds the individual and occupies space without sort of filling it up. So you can have more than one field. You can have a magnetic field and a gravitational field, for example, both acting on a single point, but without those two fields interacting with each other. And then the other sort of important physical development or development in physics that Simondon points to is the development of thermodynamics, which also appears in the 19th century. And so the second law of thermodynamics has to do with the direction of time and the fact that entropy always increases in a closed system. And so now physics, as a result of this law or in connection with this law of thermodynamics, now has a sort of directionality to time, whereas in Newtonian mechanics, you can just any sort of transformation of a system in Newtonian mechanics, if you just reverse the time direction, if you take the variable t and you put a minus sign in front of it, then that same transformation sort of played in reverse is still a valid transformation in Newtonian mechanics. So time has no sort of privileged direction in Newtonian mechanics, whereas in thermodynamics, there is a direction of time. The direction in which entropy increases is always the direction in which time is flowing or passing. And so physics now has a sort of historical dimension to it that didn't exist prior to the 19th century. So the notion of a field in which individuals are sort of embedded, and then the notion of entropy increasing over time and a directionality to time. These are the two physical notions that Simondon sees as being sort of the analogs or the equivalents of the order of succession and the order of simultaneity in philosophy.
Yeah, my comments on this section are mostly about the references to Kant, but we're about to talk about that in the next section, so maybe I'll hold off. But I think that what you were just saying about the directionality of entropy as opposed to the lack of directionality in Newtonian mechanics, it may be what he's talking about with the way that physics is no longer Kantian in the 19th century, because the mind doesn't need to contribute the directionality like it does in the analogies for Kant, to give a directionality to cause and effect, which otherwise would be reversible. We need the the way that the categories are applied in the analogies in the first critique.
Yeah, and this is still a sort of open problem in philosophy of physics, is how do we integrate, quantum physics is a sort of is similar to Newtonian physics in the sense that it doesn't have a privileged role for time, for a directionality of time, and even and then general relativity as well. Time is just one of the four dimensions of space time. And it's only in thermodynamics that we have a sort of directionality of time. But then how to sort of reconcile these two different ways of understanding time, time as just one of the four space-time dimensions or just one variable among others on the one hand, and then time as something that flows or progresses or passes in a certain direction on the other hand. And this is a sort of difficult problem, and there have been proposals that are sort of quasi Kantian in form, in the sense that they take time, the passing of time, to be something that is closely tied up with the notion of subjectivity, but I think in general they sort of reverse the direction of explanation. So they take it that subjectivity is something that can only exist when there in circumstances in which there is a decrease of entropy, an increase of entropy happening. So this is something that a situation in which there's an increase of entropy is one in which time is passing for a subject. Essentially, is the order of explanation, and so the notion of time as having a direction and the notion of subjectivity are probably closely connected to each other, and it's difficult to sort of disentangle these two notions and figure out which one is more fundamental to the other, and then how those two notions together sort of fit in with the more fundamental physics, the physics of general relativity and quantum mechanics, and how they sort of are connected to this other notion of time as just one dimension of space time.
That's really interesting. The subjectivity is being conditioned by entropy, or a kind of experience of, or being, I guess, a kind of experience of entropy.
Yeah, and it's a difficult, it's a sort of subtle issue also, because so with the passing of time would have to do with the increase of entropy. So the direction in which time passes is always the direction in which entropy is increasing. But then on the other hand, for living beings, there has to be a sort of
right.
Neg entropy is the term that's sometimes used. So a negative entropy, which has to do with the fact that living beings are open systems. So living beings are always taking in energy and matter from their environment, and so ultimately, in the case of the Earth, it depends on the fact that the sun is constantly streaming energy into the Earth. It's only because of that that we can have living beings that exist in far from equilibrium states, in a sort of stable form, and so subjectivity, if we sort of presume, which seems plausible, that subjectivity also depends on life in some degree, so only living beings can be subjects, then we have a sort of second role of entropy, where entropy also has to, we also have to have a sort of counter to that increase of entropy in order for subjectivity to appear. So the relationship between entropy and subjectivity is a complicated one.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Was it Heisenberg who wrote that paper on life as neg entropy?
Yeah, I think he's probably the first one to sort of make that identification. He has a set of lectures called "What Is Life?" So that was in the 50s, I think, when. So he's writing before DNA was identified or isolated, yeah. So this notion of life as involving a kind of neg entropy, or an isolation from the general increase of entropy, is an important one that has I think his exact formulation is probably not used anymore, but that's still like a general principle that's used in sort of theoretical biology or philosophy of biology.
Interesting.
And yeah, of course, we can tie this also into, and so entropy has a close relationship with information. When you, like in the mathematical theory of information, the Shannon and Weaver theory, one of the quantities that is measured is called entropy. Although the relationship between that kind of entropy and entropy in thermodynamics is sort of a contested one, and whether we should identify them or think of them as distinct is something that people have debated. But entropy in general has something to do with information in the sense that uh, a situation with low entropy is one in which you can make distinctions or you can distinguish different states of a metal bar that is hot at one end and cold at the other end is one in which you have different states that you can distinguish, whereas the evolution through time of that metal bar will be towards a single uniform temperature, which has no distinct states to distinguish. And so, in some sense, the metal bar with one end heated has more information. There's more sort of distinctness to the situation as opposed to the uniformly heated bar at the end of the evolution has a low amount of information in the sense that it has only the one state that doesn't vary across the bar, and so there's definitely a relationship between information and entropy, and how we can tie this in with Simondon's notion of information is probably an interesting question to pursue as well. Okay, that was a bit of a digression, but an interesting one. But we can continue with the rest with the text. Let's read the whole of the section relation with Kant, if someone else would like to read.
Yeah, I can read this section. Relation with Kant. A critique of knowledge like the one Kant produced could no longer apply to the world of electromagnetism or thermodynamics. For the field or the law of the increase in entropy are not only a way to connect phenomena, but also the very weft of phenomena, their manner of being, and more than their condition of appearing. The a priori forms of space and time as Kant defined them cannot account for the fact that the manifold of sensibilities unified prior to any apprehension in the form of a field or convergent series. The field and the convergent series of the transformations of energy are neither a sensible intuition nor an a priori form of sensibility. They are no longer the result of a synthesis, but a coherence belonging to phenomena, which displaces the very notion of phenomenon and prevents the distinction between noumenon and phenomenon from persisting in the way Kant considered it. The simple opposition between subject and object is no longer possible. Knowledge discovers in the object certain forms of coherence that are not phenomenal. The field or the convergence of the series of transformations is something quite different from a law. These realities separate and distribute the real as much as they unify it. They distinguish in order to synthesize. The rapport of the multiplicity of the sensible to the unity of the understanding can no longer be upheld. The type of intelligibility is no longer that of the law, the rapport between phenomena, but that of the field, of the spatial domain or temporal series. This is not a unification of the manifold, but the postulation of a system of the real prior to all apprehension. The given, the starting point, is no longer the phenomenon, but the system or the series given at the same time as the terms. The system and the series are the phenomena and what must be explained. One does not start with terms that would need to be unified, but with domains, with coherences whose extent and expression must be found. The individual can no longer be identified with an isolated elementary being. Great scientific discoveries of the 19th century were syntheses that simultaneously introduced the continuity and diversification of the real, particularly Maxwell's theoretical synthesis unifying the laws of optics and the laws of electricity in the formula of the propagation of electromagnetic perturbations, which defines the electromagnetic field. What is quite remarkable in this new stage of science is that there is not, on the one hand, diversity at the starting point, and on the other, unity obtained through the imposition of a law onto the manifold of the sensible. There is and there remains diversity and unity from the starting point to the end point. What scientific thought carries out is not an identification, but a universalization through the expansion of the domain. The law becomes the formula of the domain's continuity. Thus, in the electromagnetic theory of light, it cannot be said that Maxwell, properly speaking, discovered an identity between an electromagnetic perturbation and light. The formula that states the characteristics of an electromagnetic field is also, and at the same time, what allows us to distinguish different frequencies and to predict the differences of phenomena according to differences of frequency, not just for light compared to a longer or shorter wave, but also for very nearby wavelengths belonging to visible light, for example, that of indigo and violet. What Maxwell discovers is not so much the unity, but the homogeneous continuity of a domain of diversity constituted by a schematism whose characteristic parameters are capable of continuous variation, excluding classification. This continuity of a domain is therefore very different from a unity through real identification, like that of the attraction of stars and the force of gravity, or formal identification, like that of gravitational attraction and electrostatic attraction. The domain of reality discovered by Maxwell is homogeneous but not identical, and it submits to a continuous formal variation. Its homogeneity is that of a schematism, not of a substantial reality. But it is no longer just a homogeneity of formula alone. There is unity in the energetic characteristics. Science of the 19th century tends toward the energetics of Ostwald, who wants to condense all sciences into one. In the individual, there is a form of energy that is at once nothing and everything, and that constitutes the homogeneity of the individual domain through the homogeneity of its schematism. The will, which is weak in Sancourt and strong in Stendhal's Heroes, is that which introduces a common schematism into all situations and domains. It is the will that leads Faust's soul, desiccated by knowledge, to attain through the arts of magic the supreme powers of nature, the mothers, and to carry out every transmutation. Feeling and the dream are the fruitful grounds upon which the will is born. In the form of the messianic pride of the inventors of systems, in the fervor of the traditionalist, in the discovery of a new faith, as well as in hopelessness and resignation, there is the will, like a basic schema, always homogeneous with respect to itself, but infinitely diverse in its situations and manifestations. The will is what connects the individual being to the world and to history. It is what can become every act and generate every feeling. It forms the internal continuity and coherence of the individual, just as it establishes the link of reciprocal causality in the social world with the social world and historical becoming. The individual is an element of will and an ensemble of fields of forces. Despite Balzac's assertion, the 19th century wanted to create a physics more so than a chemistry of characters. It is a chemistry only in the sense in which Balzac understands it when, with Balthazar play in the quest of the absolute, he wants to discover nitrogen, the origin of all life and energy. This elementary will of the individual seeks to encounter in the world a vaster and stronger will, that of a historical fatum, of an immanent law that scoffs at resistances. The individual is not the center of a decision, but of an adhesion, not of an initiative, but of an encounter. The individual does not posit the real through himself. He associates himself with the real as he makes himself. When he discovers the sense of this will immanent to the real, it has been said that this was the age of feeling. In reality, there is no distinction between feeling and the will to adhesion, for feeling is the prophetic force that introduces the sense of becoming. What is suitable for the will that proceeds and assumes decision is intellectual knowledge. But for the will that seeks consent, what is suitable is the affective intuition that orients the being in this field of forces that the world is. Bonald, Joseph de Maistre, Auguste Comte, Saint-Simon, Fourier are born by affective intuition within the direction of the fatum in which their will unites. What traditionalism seeks is indeed a principle independent of the arbitrariness of intellectual knowledge, so that the individual will can adhere to it. Okay, yeah, obviously there's a ton in this section, and I find myself in the uncomfortable position of wanting to defend Kant here, because I just wish he had spent a lot more time on this, because I'm sure that, I'm sure he has an interesting critique, but it just doesn't seem like it's really elaborated, because obviously it just doesn't seem to be a real critique to say, well, the phenomena, we can't think of these things in terms of phenomena because there's this kind of thoroughgoing objective coherence in which they stand with relation to one another. Because obviously Kant or a Kantian would just say, yeah, obviously that's what phenomena is it's, as the world as it appears to us in accordance with the way that the understanding acts on sensibility to produce this coherent and law-abiding world of appearances.
I think it's definitely open to a Kantian, looking at 19th century science to say that this is just another instance, or maybe a more complicated instance of the same type of process as Kant identified in 18th century science, where you have instead of the Newtonian laws of mechanics, you have maybe more complicated laws of electromagnetic fields and of thermodynamics. So there would be a kind of, in the same way you would still have a kind of unification of phenomena through the action of the understanding on sensibility. But I think what the type of contrast that Simondon is trying to get at here, I think, is that in the case of electromagnetism, for example, the scientific positing of the electromagnetic field doesn't sort of play the role of taking different phenomena and then unifying them under a certain law. It doesn't say that. So the model here would be the way that the Newtonian theory of gravitation takes the following of objects to the surface of the Earth and then the orbit of the Earth around the Sun to be two phenomena that fall under the same law, and so it sort of unifies these phenomena by subordinating them, or by putting them as phenomena under one law. Whereas in the case of electromagnetism, what Maxwell does is not so much to say that light and electricity are two phenomena that fall under one law, but instead it's to posit this domain, this continuous domain of transformation of that allows for both visible light in its various frequencies, and then various forms of invisible electromagnetic radiation. And so Simondon has talked about this sort of transductive mode of thinking in volume one. We saw this in volume one, where he talks about how in the electromagnetic spectrum we have a way of thinking in which we have a sort of continuous variation across the domain, as opposed to a species and genus classification type structure. And I think it's that type of contrast is what he's trying to get at here. So the Kantian model of science is one in which we sort of unify our picture of the world through subordinating phenomena to laws. And then our capacity to do that is grounded in the fact that the laws have to do with the structure of the understanding. Whereas in 19th century physics, we have instead this sort of positing of a domain of transduction in which we are no longer subordinating phenomena to laws, but instead we're producing this continuous domain of variation in which various phenomena appear.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that makes me want to go back to that reference to Kant in volume one, where he has this pretty brief section where he basically says, well, this is why I don't need to worry about kind of a Kantian objection to my epistemology, because of, if I remember correctly, it's because of the transductivity of knowledge, which is outlined in like the allegmatics piece, that because we can think the analogically valid relation between these different domains, and because it's the relation that's primary, that the Kantian objection is therefore not appropriate somehow. But I need to go back to that.
Yeah, he does sort of go through it a little bit quickly, but I think the idea is that transduction is both a mode of thought and a mode of being. So the when we sort of perform transduction in our thinking, we're actually sort of implementing transduction as a mode of being, as opposed to trying to sort of reflect in our thought some process or property of being outside our thought, which is sort of the picture that Kant wants to say is not sort of workable. So what we're doing when we think transductively, when Maxwell, for example, puts together this notion of the electromagnetic spectrum, he's actually sort of doing transduction at the same time as he's thinking about transduction, and so he's sort of setting transduction to work as opposed to looking at a transductive process and then trying to reflect that transductive process in thought outside of that process. So I think that's the picture that Simondon wants us to sort of move towards is transduction as a process that occurs both in thought and in the world that we think about. And it's the same process, the same transductive process that is occurring on both sides of the subject-object divide or between that subject-object divide.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. I still wish he had spent more time on Kant here.
Yeah, it would have been, and we were talking about this a little bit before we started recording, but it's a strange sort of choice of construction of this text, that this sort of history of philosophy, to go through the history of 18th century philosophy and talk about some seemingly minor figures, and then just sort of skip over Kant and go into the 19th century, and then have a section on the relationship with Kant, but not have a section actually on Kant himself. And it would have been interesting to see what Simondon would have made of Kant's doctrine of the individual. There's quite a bit of there's a lot to do with what Kant has to say about the nature of individuality in the physical world, and in relation to his practical philosophy as well. And so that would have been very interesting to see what Simondon had to say about Kant on the notion of the individual.
Yeah, definitely.
And then the other bit, so that we talked about the first part of the passage that we just read, but there's also the second part where he brings up this notion of the will. And it's a kind of a strange transition, or sort of absence of a transition, where he's talking about 19th century physics and its relation to Kant, and then he just sort of jumps immediately into talking about the will. But I think the idea, it sort of becomes clearer as we read the next sections, I think. But the idea here is that in the same way that in 19th century physics, we have this notion of a electromagnetic spectrum and electromagnetic fields that sort of surpass the individual. The individual is always incorporated or integrated into an environment in which there are all these fields that act on the individual. In the same way, the social environment of the individual acts on the individual as if through the action of a field. So the individual entity, the individual person, in the case of social reality, is always integrated into something greater than them, that sort of brings about the transformations that that individual person undergoes. And so the will here is a kind of principle of adequation to this greater reality. So the question, or the problem, is to try to that a number of 19th century writers will pick up, is to try to find a way to integrate the will of the individual with the social field in which the individual is inserted. So what exactly that relation is supposed to look like is something that different authors have different ways of presenting. And so Simondon points to what he calls the traditionalists. So we'll see a couple of those in the next couple sections. So these are people who take the social order to be fundamental and primary, and then the individual is always subordinated to that social order, and the what is sort of the principle by which the social order should be governed is one of stability. So the social order should stay the same or should be stable, and then any attempts to sort of transform that social order are dangerous because they are sort of getting the order of society backwards. They're trying to subordinate the social order to the needs of the individual as opposed to the other way around. And then we have sort of, well, Simenon doesn't talk about these people that much, but the sort of utopian writers like Saint-Simon and Fourier, who try to do the other direction. They try to come up with these proposals for what the social order should look like in such a way that the individual would be integrated into that order in a sort of harmonious way. So whereas society as they see it is involves this sort of conflict between the individual's needs and the requirements that society imposes on them, in this utopian order that they're proposing, the individual would be inserted into the order of society in a way that wouldn't have this kind of conflict. And so this is sort of looking at the relationship between the individual and the social in an opposite direction to the way that the traditionalists are going to look at it. So we want to rearrange the social order in such a way that the individual can be integrated into it without conflict. That's sort of the problem that these writers set for themselves. Okay, let's go on to the next section. Joseph de Maistre, if someone else would like to read.
Okay, let me read.
Sure.
Joseph de Maistre. According to Joseph de Maistre, the individual should adhere to the supernatural, which is denied and obliterated by the natural sciences. Religious life is the communication of man with the sphere superior to humanity. Joseph de Maistre transposes Illuminism and Martinism into religious doctrine. The individual being submits to this fatum. It quotes, each active being exerts its action and in the circle sketched out for it without ever being able to escape. End of quotes. Nevertheless, despite the somewhat cellular structure of the universe, there can be asymptotic relations between one order of reality and another. The animal's instinct can be, quotes, asymptotic with a reason, end of quotes. A reason, in turn, can be asymptotic with the superior minds. Certain phenomena of the inferior order that are inexplicable through this order itself could be due to the action of this superior order. The action of the superior order on the inferior order is possible, but this action is irreversible. A mysterious divine action penetrates the order of matter. For the individual, the field of the possible is not limited by the consideration of natural causes. The individual being, in fact, can also be in veritable communication with the superior order as well as with the inferior order. He is inserted in both orders, and he possesses two types of effectiveness which are not at all identical. Prayer can be as effective against lightning as a lightning rod. It acts on the same reality but through totally different means, because they are part of two different orders, the inferior and the superior. The Lyonnais Illuminism, known to Joseph de Maistre, transforms into a philosophy that places the individual in the midst of network forces and fields of different orders. The fields of superior forces becomes superposed on the system of material realities without modifying this system. Since it is not sensitive to this field, thus a magnetic field can be superposed on a system of gravitational masses without modifying it at all. But if a body is found in the system that possesses both a gravitational mass like the others magnetic masses that belong to it alone. It will be out of this whole system, connected to the magnetic field by the forces, and yet will conserve its gravitational mass within the system in which it is inserted, without modification of the system. It is in fact as an individual sensitive to the magnetic field, and not as a gravitational mass forming part of the system of the other gravitational forces, that this individual is in a relation of participation with the magnetic field. In the same way, the enlightened is in a relation with the order of supernatural forces, while remaining inserted in the order of natural realities, while submitting to the actions and reactions of these realities. The individual is not part of a single system. Even when he is inserted in a system, the individual surpasses it, overflows it, and is connected to a superior reality that he never managed to comprehend. It is therefore through the adhesion of the will that the individual is connected to this superior order of forces, not through the intelligence. The justice and providence of the supernatural order have nothing to do with the human justice and providence. The reversibility of the culprit's wrongs against the innocence is opposed to the culprit's responsibility. Religious sacrifices, wars, the French Revolution invoke a type of relation that we cannot understand, which is analog to that of the reversibility of wrongs. Does it will continue?
Let's stop here for this section. Yeah, I mean, I don't have a lot to say about Demaitre. He was one of these traditionalists that Simondon mentions in the previous section. So he's writing primarily in opposition to the French Revolution, and so he sees the French Revolution as a sort of illegitimate attempt to subordinate the social order to the needs of the individual, as opposed to subordinating the individual to the social order. And so there's this picture of the social order as sort of evolving in this natural way, so that institutions that exist are the result of this evolution, and then trying to change these institutions through the use of our reason. Looking at social arrangements and saying, this is not a rational social arrangement, is a kind of overturning of that order, and is a kind of arrogance of reason. And then this natural social order is sort of integrated into the supernatural order, and so we again, shouldn't be trying to overturn existing social orders in light of our judgment of what a better social order would look like. We should sort of integrate our will as individuals into the existing social order without trying to overturn it.
Here, what is super? How we can distinguish like super order and then superior order and inferior order?
So here, I think it has to do with the order of nature, and then the divine order that is superior to it. So the inferior order would be the order of nature, and then the divine order would be the superior order. And so there's this idea that the natural order is sort of incorporated into, or is subordinated to, the divine order. And so even though the natural world has its own laws and structures and so on, it's still subject to the action of the divine order in which it is incorporated, or which is sort of hovering above it, I guess. But yeah, so that's what the distinction between inferior and superior orders has to do with here.
So definitely, then this person's name is pronounced maître, not mestre, first.
Yes, that's right.
Maître, and then this person thinks like there's a hierarchical order between nature and God, that it's not kind of identical. Like as we can see in the Spinoza, like nature equal to God as far as I understand, but here divine God's order comes kind of first, and then nature order is, as you said, like subordinate to the gods or something like that. Then human beings, like a wall is in between them. That's what it says here, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. He's definitely not a Spinozist, so he doesn't take God and nature to be identical. And the divine order is superior to the natural order. And so, things like miracles can happen by the sort of intervention of the divine order into the natural order.
Thank you.
He sort of seems like, as I mentioned earlier, I've been reading about the pantheism controversy stuff, but he seems kind of like Jacobi or these other thinkers who were worried about or skeptical of the use of reason to criticize common sense and faith. But I guess that's like maybe a much older issue in philosophy of the relationship between reason and dogma. I actually think Jacobi is really interesting, but I tend to agree with his criticisms of some of the Enlightenment positions, but then I think he draws the absolutely opposite conclusion from what I would draw, which is, he basically argues for this irrational support of common sense and faith, as opposed to just kind of realizing that reason can't sustain either one.
Yeah, Jacobi is definitely an interesting figure, and I agree with you that I find his conclusions that he arrives at pretty unsympathetic, but he definitely poses interesting problems, and I would say he's a careful writer in the sense that he actually sort of takes seriously people like Kant and Fichte and wants to see he wants to sort of push their thought to its furthest consequences, and then say that this is sort of unacceptable, and therefore we have to deny the capacity of reason to sort of have a real knowledge of the world that is an improvement or is superior to common sense and faith. So it's definitely a bigger problem than just, or it extends beyond Jacobi and this sort of religious context. But I think there's a more general problem of to what extent we should consider reason to be something that we can rely on, or that can sort of guide our action. For example, in Hume, who Jacobi writes about as well. But Hume argues in his more theoretical text that, for example, that we have no idea of cause, that our notion of cause or our use of the term cause has to do with just a habit of constant conjunction. So we see event A or event of type A, and then we see events of type B repeated, fire and smoke, and we see fire and then we see smoke, constantly repeated. And then we just, as a result of habit, we use the term cause, and we say the fire causes smoke. But then, so this, in his sort of rational, or his use of reason, Hume argues that we don't have any notion of cause. But then in his more and even he admits this himself, this is something we can only sort of believe when we're sitting in our study and reading or writing philosophical texts. But then as soon as we get up from the table and make a cup of tea or get something to eat or whatever, then we're immediately using our concept of causation for everything that we do. So we have this sort of disjunction between reason that leads us to this skepticism, and then our practical life, where we have to rely on these concepts that we rationally think are unfounded. And so trying to overcome this opposition, or trying to deal with this opposition between reason and practical life, I think is a bigger problem beyond just the religious context in which Jacobi or Demaitre are operating, and it's I think still a live philosophical problem, even if you don't have any sympathy with the sort of religious answer that Jacobi gives.
Yeah, I was reading about Mendelssohn's this like allegory. I think it was a description of a dream that he had of common sense and reason as sort of like personae traveling through the mountains. And I guess the point was that they often part ways, but usually come back to one another, and their reuniting is like mediated by reason. And it was speculation and common sense reunited by reason. But I was thinking like, well, it's kind of stupid to say that common sense should like trump the kind of the reasonable and speculative position. But even when we're working through like a text like this, it's common for somebody to say, and this makes sense because if you think about it in this context, there's this kind of common sense application that we can make of this idea. And yeah, I think just, further to what you were saying, it's still a big issue. Whether or not anybody would believe anything that seems to totally fly in the face of everyday experience, or whether that would be, make for a convincing argument, or it does seem that there has to be some kind of connection to common sense.
And I would put it, common sense is a kind of a complicated term. I think like that there's a lot of different things that are included under what we call common sense. Like, there's, I guess, sort of the basic structure of what the world looks like, things like, events have causes and so on. But then we also have I guess you could call them like maxims of practical life, like, you shouldn't spend all your money on candles or whatever.
Right.
Just sort of practical maxims of like how to live a good life, or not even a good life, but a sort of decent life. And so common sense includes a lot of different things. But what I would sort of focus on, or the one that I think is maybe the most interesting problem, is integrating or finding a connection between reason, or the speculative use of reason, and then practical life, in the sense that we can in practical life, we have to sort of think of ourselves as finite agents. So we are situated in a particular historical and social circumstances. You have to deal with this specific situation that you find yourself in, and not just sort of reason about principles of morality in general, but you have to say, what should I do in this specific situation? And so finding a way to integrate or connect the our rational understanding of the world, what the structure of the world is, and what the nature of a human being is, and so on. These sort of speculative ideas, and then connecting that to our understanding of this specific situation, and deciding what I'm going to do now.
Right.
I think that's an interesting and difficult problem that is sort of in line, or is connected to the types of problems that Jacobi and Demaitre were talking about.
Yeah, that's a great point. Sorry, go ahead, Ollie.
Sorry. So another interesting point is like the end of this part. Then what it says is that the individual is not part of a single system. That part. So what I understand from this one is like the individual belongs to. I mean the agency of subjective individual doesn't tell the whole order of the world. So at the end of the day, like the individual, there is some kind of like dogmatic force, like which individuals can't do anything about. So I just like found like the Metter's idea is like the in a way like related to the emergence of totalitarianism, like cause like after this time maybe like the people would think about. I mean the era of enlightenment has come, so you can't go back to some kind of like the era of like the god. Instead of that, like if Metter's idea was convincing at that time, maybe like as stated in on an academic paper, maybe it has to do with like some kind of, the emergence of totalitarianism, is it? So kind of like there's a part that human beings can't control. There's just some kind of like a absolute one, like a not of God, but of something. So the method try to point out that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think some of the criticisms that Demetre makes of the French Revolution are similar to criticisms that some 20th century writers made of communism, in the sense that they take it that trying to use our reason to produce a better order of society inevitably leads to tyranny, because you have to and it means an individual is sort of judging the social order and saying this social order is inadequate, and we have to instead institute my preferred system. But every other individual will have some other system that they would prefer, and so the only way to actually implement your preferred system is to impose it by force. So this is the type of argument that's used by right-wing authors, after the French Revolution, and then again in the 20th century. And so instead of sort of using our reason to judge the social order and come up with a better one, they think that we have to subordinate our reason to the existing social order, which is itself has a sort of divine authority. It's subordinated to the divine order that actually governs it, and so this is a similar type of argument as we find in 20th century right-wing authors.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
I think, Angus, you said you had to leave around now, I think, right?
Yeah, I should probably head to bed.
Yeah, okay. So let's stop here, and then we'll pick up on the section on Bonad next time. Okay, so let me make sure that I write down where we are for next time, so that we don't get lost as we did to start today. But yeah, so thank you everyone for coming out, and hope to see you next week.